Hello, it's Supernatural Sammy, and it's time to step into the mysterious world of the supernatural and join me for a compilation of some of the earlier stories from the Paranormal Files. Get ready to delve into the eerie world of cannibals, witches, and amazing animal connections. This is the true story of the Thanksgiving Day cannibal. Omaima Ari grew up poor in a small village in Egypt near Sudan. She had a very difficult life. She was abused by her father, and on top of that, she was forced by him to get female genital mutilation. Her mother was also abused by her father. The two of them managed to leave, but had to live in a slum in Cairo. The slum was built around graves, giving it the name the City of the Dead. At 18, she met an American man that worked in the oil industry. They began a relationship, got married, and moved to America in 1986. The relationship didn't last long, and they ended up getting divorced. To survive, she worked as a nanny and did some modeling, but that wasn't enough. So she began stealing and used her good looks to get men to give her money. She managed to trick one man, Robert Hansen. She tied him to a chair, pointed a shotgun at him, and threatened him. She demanded he give her all his money. After this, she moved to California to avoid getting caught. That's where she met Bill Nelson. Bill was a wealthy man and a show-off. His friends described him as being larger than life. He would brag about all the cash he had and the land he owned, and would drive around in his red Corvette. In the past, Bill was a pilot. He was caught transporting cannabis and was sent to prison for 4 years. He had also moved to California to begin a new life. In 1991, they met at a bar in Orange County, California. They spent the night drinking and playing pool. Bill told her about how rich he was and all the land he owned. She was very happy to hear this. After just a few days, they got married. Bill was 56, Omaima was 23. Bill was very happy to marry a beautiful woman so much younger than him, and would often brag about it. They were married by an Egyptian priest with a telephone ceremony. But Bill was hiding something from Omaima. He was already married. His divorce with his ex-wife had not been finalized, so their marriage wasn't legal. After the ceremony, they went to Texas and on a honeymoon to see Bill's family. His family was not happy about Bill marrying a woman who was half his age. They then went back to California to live in Bill's apartment. On Thanksgiving Day, Bill invited his daughter over for Thanksgiving dinner. He told her how happy he was being married to Omaima. His daughter declined, and that was the last time she talked to her father. On the morning of December 1st, 1991, a man named Jose hears a loud pounding on his door. Jose looked outside and saw a red Corvette in his driveway, but didn't answer the door. Later, the Corvette returned. He answered the door, and he saw it was Omaima. The two of them had gone out a few times in the past. She was crying and had scratches on her face and hands. She told him that Bill had attacked her, and she had no choice but to kill him. She showed him a garbage bag filled with chopped up pieces of human remains and asked him to help her get rid of the body. She told him if he helped her, she would give him $75,000 and 2 motorcycles. He agreed to help and told her to go back to the apartment and wait for him while he went to get a truck. As soon as she left, he called the police and told them everything. The police spotted her in the Corvette and pulled her over. They found the bags with the remains, then went to the apartment where they found suitcases with bags filled with human organs and tissue. They found a clothing iron and a broken lamp with blood on them. In the bedroom was a mattress that was completely saturated in blood. In the bathroom was a butchered and gutted human torso hung up with hangers over the bathtub, blood still dripping out into the drain. Then in the kitchen, they found a deep fryer with cooked turkey meat and 2 human hands floating in the oil. On the counter, cut up pieces of bone and tissue. In a pot was human meat cooked with turkey and cranberry sauce. Then lastly, the freezer. In the freezer, they found Bill's head wrapped up in foil. It was also cooked in the deep fryer. When they questioned Omaima, she told them that Bill had killed someone and these were his remains, and that Bill was away on a trip. The police told her they found Bill's head, so they knew she was lying. She then told them several different stories. One was that an ancient Egyptian demon told her to kill Bill and chop up his body. Another was that Bill was abusive, so she had to kill him for self-defense. She was then brought in and examined by a doctor to check for evidence of abuse. She showed no signs of trauma or abuse. The cuts she had on her body were determined to be made by her. It appeared she scratched herself all over her body, then cut herself with a knife. The investigators came up with what they think actually happened that Thanksgiving Day. They think Bill was tied up by Omaima willingly, and that she had found out about the marriage not being legal. She demanded money from him. When he said no, she cut off his genitals, then hit him in the head several times and stabbed him with scissors, then dismembered his body. Bill's cause of death was determined to be due to blunt force trauma to the head. The medical professional that examined Bill's remains said the cuts looked very precise and that she had most likely done this before. 100 pounds of Bill's body was never found. It was later assumed that she had put it in the garbage disposal. Omaima told her psychologist that she had cooked Bill's ribs in barbecue sauce and ate them. She said how sweet human meat was and how Bill was especially delicious and sweet. She was diagnosed with PTSD from the past abuse. She continued to claim that Bill abused her and told a story that she had been tied up by him. She said she managed to get a hand free and hit Bill, then stabbed him. She said she had no memory of cutting up and cooking his body. The evidence showed that Bill was tied up. His ankles had marks on them. In January 1993, Omaima was charged with second-degree murder, 28 years to life. While in prison, she married a wealthy disabled man who was a fan of hers. He was 70 years old. He died not long after getting married, leaving her a lot of money. Omaima was denied parole in 2006, and then again in 2011. She is eligible again in 2026. The Bell Witch legend is called America's Greatest Ghost Story by Dr. Nanner Fodor, a lawyer who later became a parapsychologist. The story starts in a cabin that sits on 1,000 acres of land in Red River, Tennessee, owned by John and Lucy Bell. John and Lucy lived with their 6 kids and were tormented by an entity later called the Bell Witch. Even the name Bell Witch is strange, because it didn't look or act like the way you would think a witch would act. No one's been able to figure out what this entity really was. The witch, who identified herself as Kate, was very egotistical and manipulative. She tortured not only the Bell family, but also those who traveled through the area, doing everything from materializing objects out of nowhere to vigorously attacking members of the Bell family. She first revealed herself in 1817. John Bell was out hunting in his cornfield when he was startled by a strange-looking creature. It was sitting between the rows of corn, staring at him. He first thought it was a dog, but as he got closer, he saw the face looked rabbit-like. The strange-looking creature scared him, so he shot at it, and the creature disappeared. John shrugged off the strange encounter and went on with his day. Later that night, the family started hearing loud pounding sounds on the outside walls of the house. John and his sons ran outside, but nothing was there. The Bell's daughter, Elizabeth, also known as Betsy, was smart. She knew a lot about plants and animals, and she was somewhat of a naturalist. Betsy was taking a walk through the orchard when she saw what looked like a woman. She tried to speak to her, but the woman just disappeared. The loud banging and pounding sounds not only kept happening at night, but soon it began happening every night. The banging got louder and louder until the family started hearing sounds coming from the inside of the house. The kids began to hear what sounded like something gnawing on the bedposts. They thought it was rats. Scratching sounds and knocks were heard on the bedroom walls. They would be woken up by something pulling the blankets off their bed, and their pillows would be thrown across the room by something they couldn't see. The family started trying to communicate with the entity, mostly the boys, asking it simple math questions that it would answer with knocks. They asked how many people lived in the house. It knocked the correct number of times, with 8 knocks. They would ask it yes or no questions that it would answer with 1 knock for yes or 2 for no. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to be intelligent. Then, they started hearing a faint whispering voice. The voice was very quiet and sounded like a very old woman. They couldn't tell what it was saying. Sometimes it sounded like it was singing. Over time, the voice got stronger, and one day, the boys asked it who it was and what it wanted. The voice answered, and it said it was a spirit who was once happy but had been disturbed. The kids continued to be tormented at night, getting their hair pulled, sometimes getting slapped. This would also happen to visitors and even other people that lived in the area. During this time, John Bell began having trouble eating. His tongue would swell and he'd have trouble swallowing and chewing food. Sometimes he would randomly have full-body spasms. But John wasn't the only target of the witch. His daughter Betsy would be violently attacked at night. Betsy would be woken up with her hair being pulled, she would be slapped, scratched, and sometimes pulled off her bed. She would have bruises and welts on her body. Other times, Betsy would go into a deep trance-like state for several hours without explanation and then just come out of it. The Bells wanted to keep this haunting by the witch a secret. They felt ashamed. But it got so bad that John eventually told his friend James Johnson and asked him for help. Both Mr. and Mrs. Johnson came over and spent the night. Then, when everyone in the house was asleep, the entity entered the Johnsons' bedroom and ripped the covers from their bed. Mr. Johnson was slapped. He was shocked and sat up demanding the spirit show itself and explain why it was there. There was no response, and the rest of the night was quiet. Mr. Johnson told John Bell the next morning that he thought it was an evil entity and that he should find more help. The entity seemed to enjoy the attention of visitors coming to see it, and began to be able to speak in complete sentences. The once weak voice began sounding like a young woman. The witch would use her ability to speak or do things that couldn't be explained. Once she repeated 2 sermons, word for word, from 2 different churches that were far from each other while they were happening. The Bells and their visitors continued to ask the entity what it was, and it would give them different responses. One being that it was the spirit of a Native American whose grave was disturbed. There were many mounds around that were burial places for natives, so this was possible. On one occasion, a visitor brought the bones from one of these mounds into the Bell house and threw them against the wall. A tooth from the bones came off and fell through a crack in the floor. The spirit said it couldn't rest until the tooth was found. They searched, but never found the tooth. Another time, a man called Reverend James Gunn asked the spirit who it was. This time, the spirit said it was an immigrant that had hidden a lot of money before they died, and they wanted Betsy to have it. The family then went out, following the directions the spirit gave them, trying to find the treasure. They traveled to a corner of the Bells' property and dug where the entity said, for hours. They never found any money, and when they returned, the spirit teased them and laughed at them. Eventually, the spirit claimed that it was really the spirit of a woman named Kate Batts, though some think the entity wasn't Kate herself, but was a spirit conjured from Kate to seek revenge. From then on, the spirit would be called Kate. Kate Batts was a strong-willed, funny woman who ran her farm alone. Her husband, Frederick Batts, was handicapped. Kate was quite successful in running her farm and was known to have quite a personality, seeming a little nutty to some people in town. Some think the entity had nothing to do with Kate Batts at all, but chose her because of her personality. The Bell Witch was getting a lot of attention. Eventually, a man named Mr. Williams, a professional detective, heard about the Bell Witch and traveled from far away to see what was really going on at the Bell house. He specialized in solving mysteries and did not believe in the supernatural. He went to the house specifically to disprove what was going on and expose the whole thing as a hoax. Mr. Bell kindly invited him in. A few days went by with nothing happening, and one evening the house was full of guests. Mr. Williams began exclaiming how this was a hoax put on by the family. He said they were using ventriloquism and tricks to fool everyone, and they were all falling for it. John became angry and threatened to kick him out. Then, at that second, Kate spoke, telling old John to let him stay, and that she would show him he's not so smart. Later that evening, people waited anxiously for the witch to speak. It was quiet, and soon everyone became tired and began getting ready for bed. Mattresses were put out in the living room for guests. Mr. Williams fell asleep. He was abruptly woken up by an unseen force pinning him to the floor. He was completely powerless. The witch began scratching and hitting him. Mr. Williams screamed out for help. The witch continued attacking him, while mockingly asking him to tell her the name of the family member he thought was attacking him. He was beaten for 2 minutes until a candle was lit. Then the beating stopped. Mr. Williams was terrified. Sitting up in a chair with a candle, kept awake by the witch, continuously ridiculing him and asking him how the investigation was going and how long he was going to stay. As soon as morning came, Mr. Williams got his horse and took off. The strange haunting of the Bell family by the entity called Kate continued, and people kept coming to visit and witness what the witch could do. One source says that even General Andrew Jackson and some of his men came to see Kate. John Bell and his brothers, Drury and Jesse, fought in the Battle of New Orleans under Jackson's command, and when Jackson heard about the Bell Witch, he gathered the men and they made their way to the Bell House. On the way there, the horses suddenly stopped. No matter what the men tried, they couldn't get the horses to move. But as far as they could tell, there wasn't anything to stop them. Nothing blocking the road, and no sign of a predatory animal nearby. After trying for several minutes to move the horses, Jackson said out loud, "It must be the Bell Witch." Then Kate's voice was heard. She gave them permission to continue, and said she would see them later that night. The men set up camp in the Bell's yard, then went inside for dinner. So far the night was uneventful, and everyone sat around telling stories. One man claimed to be a witch tamer. He bragged that he was why Kate hadn't come out. He took out a pistol that was loaded with a silver bullet, and said Kate was afraid of it. Then, suddenly the man jumped up screaming and jerking around, saying he was being poked with needles. He then was kicked in the butt by an unseen force, sending him screaming out the front door. Kate then spoke, saying that man was a fraud, and that there was another among Jackson's men, and she would reveal him tomorrow. Jackson's men begged Jackson to leave, but Jackson wanted to stay. He wanted to know who the other fraud was. That night the men slept in their tents, and were gone early the next day. No one knows what happened that night, but some claim that Jackson said, "I would rather fight the British at New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch." But Kate wasn't always abusing and insulting. Sometimes she was helpful. She would manifest food like grapes and nuts. When someone in the family misplaced something, she would find it for them. Kate really liked Lucy Bell. She said Lucy was a good woman and would call her Old Luce. She would often help her. When Lucy got sick, Kate would sing to her and give her food. This was even witnessed by a group of women that were visiting Lucy. Kate had other nicknames for the adults in the house. John was called Old Jack, and the Bell's close friend was called Old Sugarmouth. The witch no longer abused Betsy like she did in the past, but started only bothering her when she was with the boy she liked, Joshua Gardner. Betsy and Joshua went to school together and began a relationship. They even got engaged. Kate did not approve of Betsy seeing Joshua and would bother them any time they were together. Kate would tell Betsy not to marry Joshua. Betsy and Joshua would try to escape the witch by going outside and away from the house, but Kate would follow. Eventually, Betsy and Joshua called off their engagement, and Kate left Betsy alone. Another man was interested in Betsy, Professor Richard Powell. Powell was previously Betsy and Joshua's teacher, and was quite a bit older than Betsy. He was supposedly a genius at mathematics and studied the occult and ventriloquism. He was also married at the time to a woman named Esther Scott in Nashville. He kept his marriage to her a secret. He later married Betsy. The witch set her sight on John Bell and would continue to harass him and tell him how she was going to kill him. John would keep suffering from twitching and trouble swallowing. One day while working on his farm, John was tripped, then attacked. He then had a seizure. This left him confined to the house, where he would be tortured by Kate. His shoes would be taken if he wanted to walk around. She would curse at him and slap him on days he seemed to be feeling better. One day the family found a small glass container containing liquid hidden in a chimney flue, and gave it to the doctor that treated John. The witch said that it was going to be used by her to kill John. The doctor left with the mysterious container. John's health continued to deteriorate. On December 20th, 1820, while the family ate breakfast, they heard Kate say how she had killed John Bell with a bottle from his medicine cabinet. When the family checked, all the medicine was gone, except a small bottle like the one the doctor had taken away before. John Jr. threw the bottle into the fire, where it created a blue flame. John passed away the next day. John's funeral was one of the largest that town had seen. Many people coming from miles away. During the funeral, Kate was heard laughing and singing. She continued until everyone had left. In 1821, the Bell Witch told Lucy Bell that she would be departing and would come back in 7 years. Kate did return in 1828 to visit John Bell Jr. She would talk to him about life and spirituality. The witch also made some predictions about the Civil War and other things that ultimately didn't happen. She left again after a few days, saying she would come back in 1935. There is nothing written about the Bell Witch returning, but many think she never left. Who or what was the Bell Witch? Many think the family made up the story or faked the haunting, but the detail and mass number of witnesses and events would be hard to create. There are numerous books written about the happenings, filled with accounts. There are some popular non-extraordinary theories on what happened at the Bell property. Some accuse Betsy and her brothers of arranging the incidents that resulted in the death of their father. John Bell was accused of abusing Betsy and his daughters. Some say Lucy Bell was the one who poisoned her husband. But the man who married Betsy, Professor Richard Powell, had a strange history. In his book, he briefly mentioned being married to Esther, but doesn't talk about her death. He does talk about Betsy and their marriage. He would visit the Bells often, but John Bell never liked Powell. He didn't appreciate how interested he was in young Betsy. The witch never came out or spoke when Powell was at the Bells. Powell was very mean to the slaves that worked on the property. Many of them suspected Powell was the cause all along, with his goal being to marry Betsy and get her family's money. Maybe he was so mean to the slaves because they knew he was behind the haunting. Some think that Powell used voodoo because New Orleans wasn't far. Could the Bell Witch be the result of a curse or summoned spirit? Some think Powell used a book of magic to create the Bell Witch. Powell had a strange book that he wouldn't let anyone touch. He claimed it was an antique geometry book, and that it was very fragile. According to John and Calvin Johnson, the sons of James Johnson, they got a quick glimpse of the strange book Powell had. They found the book on Powell's desk. It was written in a language they didn't know, and had many strange symbols in it. They were only able to get a quick look because Powell came in and demanded they hand it over. Besides that one account, there's no record of this book. If it was Powell, he got what he wanted. John Bell died, and he married Betsy, and after these events, the Bell Witch left. Powell became sheriff of Robertson County for 3 years. Then him and Betsy and their 8 children lost most of their things in a steamboat accident. During that time, Powell also suffered a stroke. They stayed poor, and Powell died in 1848. Betsy moved to Mississippi and remained a widow until she died in 1888. Whether it was Powell, an ancient Native American curse, or something else, the Bell Witch remains one of the strangest hauntings in history. On the March 3, 1961 edition of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, you can find the story of Sam Rogers. Sam was a postman for 44 years in Shropshire, England. He also worked as a handyman around town, and he enjoyed beekeeping in his spare time. He had 14 hives. He really loved his bees. He treated them like family. He would talk to them kindly each day while he cared for them. Sam thoroughly enjoyed spending time with his bees. Then one day, Sam didn't come to the hive. 6 weeks after he retired, Sam passed away. After he died, 2 of his children visited the hive and spoke to the bees like Sam would. They walked through the many hives in sadness, telling the bees that Sam would not be returning. But what happened at Sam's memorial service would amaze everyone and leave bee experts shocked. The day after the funeral, a memorial service for Sam was being held at a church in town, about 1.5 miles away from his house. Without warning, thousands of bees came swarming in, completely ignoring the flowering trees by the church. They came from the direction of Sam's house. The bees began to land on Sam's grave and nearby wreaths and ornaments around his grave. The people attending were amazed by what they were seeing. Most of the bees stayed for about an hour. Some stayed until nightfall, flying back in the direction of Sam's house when they left. The reverend from the church talked to the local newspaper, telling them the incredible story. The reverend described the bees as forming lines around and on Sam's grave. Skeptics say that the bees were simply attracted to the new flowers that were on and near Sam's grave, but there had been plenty of funerals there before, and fresh flowers laid on graves, and never had swarms of bees landed on a grave like this. Nothing like this was seen before. A local bee expert, who was chairman of the Bee Association, found the whole thing very strange. Sam passed away in February, and bees are normally sluggish that time of year. They rarely leave the hive, especially in huge swarms like that. He had no explanation other than that the bees must have come to say goodbye to Sam. This isn't the only event of bees saying goodbye to their keeper. In May 1956, John Zepka from Adams, Massachusetts, passed away. The day he was buried, swarms of bees landed on the tent and flower arrangements around the grave. The bees stayed for the funeral and then left as soon as it was over. Like Sam, John loved his bees and spent much of his time caring for them. As incredible as this is, I've saved my favorite story for last. All of these stories are true, so if you want to look up this story later, search for the most loyal dog, Hachiko. On November 10, 1923, Hachiko the Akita was born on a farm in Japan. A man named Hadisabuto Ueno bought Hachiko in 1924 for 30 yen. He was a professor at the Imperial University in Tokyo and taught about agriculture. Ueno and Hachiko lived together in Tokyo. Every morning they would walk to the Shibuya train station together. Then Ueno would take the train to work. Then at 3 p.m., Hachiko would meet him and they would walk home together. That was their routine every day, until one day, in May 1925, Ueno did not get off the train. Ueno had died while teaching a class from a brain hemorrhage. He was only 53. Hachiko came to the train station the same way he did every day, waiting for Ueno. Hachiko waited and waited. When Ueno didn't come, he eventually left, then came back the next day, right at 3 p.m., hoping to greet his friend. Hachiko didn't give up and continued to come to the station, day after day. Hachiko was given away after his owner's death, but that didn't stop him from running away to the train station any chance he got. The workers at the station were annoyed at Hachiko at first, but soon realized how loyal Hachiko was and began to admire him. They would bring him treats, sit by him, and pet him. Hachiko, being a very sweet boy, enjoyed the attention. Hachiko continued to come back, and soon he'd become an idol. One of the professor's students heard about Hachiko and took a trip to the station to see him. Hachiko was there, waiting as expected, and the student followed Hachiko to the home of the man who took in Hachiko after Ueno passed. His name was Kuzaburo. He used to be Ueno's gardener. While there, he heard the story of Hachiko and was so touched by the loyalty of Hachiko, he wrote a few articles talking about the amazing story. He also happened to be an expert on Akitas and found out that Hachiko was one of only 30 purebred Akitas documented in Japan. One of his articles made it into the newspaper in 1932, and soon Hachiko's story was known all over Japan, and Hachiko was famous. Hachiko became a figure of faithfulness and loyalty, and many people would come visit him, even traveling from far away. Hachiko would come back for 9 years, 9 months, and 15 days, even in his old age, to wait for his beloved friend. He waited until the day he died, on March 8, 1935, at the age of 11. When Hachiko died and made the papers, he was cremated and put next to his owner's grave. His fur was preserved and stuffed, and he can now be seen at the National Museum of Nature and Science in Tokyo, Japan. Hachiko was so loved that donations were made to create a bronze statue of him. It was put up at the same spot at the station he would greet his beloved owner each day. But during World War II, the statue was melted and made into ammo. In 1948, a new statue was made in Shibuya Station, where it still stands today. People who pass by it are reminded of Hachiko's dedication and loyalty. The entrance of the station is even named after Hachiko. Another statue of Hachiko was put up in 2004 in the town he was born. It's in front of the Akita Dog Museum. And another one is at the University of Tokyo for the 80th anniversary of Hachiko's death. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the unknown. There are forces beyond our understanding, and the truth is out there, waiting to be discovered. There are many more creepy videos coming in the future, so make sure to come back for more. Thank you so much for watching, and please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.